The question of military competence has haunted the reputations of the Allied High Command for decades, with some commanders celebrated as heroes, while others are dismissed as cautious bureaucrats. In this video, we're ranking the 5 most competent Allied officers in the European theatre of World War II, measuring them not just by their victories, but by the complexity of their challenges, the scale of their command, and the lasting impact of their decisions on the course of history. Our list begins with an officer often described as the Allies' finest diplomat in uniform, the British Field Marshal Harold Alexander. Alexander was the one Allied general who never lost a battle, but that's because he never really won one either. Frequently overshadowed by more bombastic personalities, Alexander's particular genius lay elsewhere. His domain was the grueling, politically charged, and attritional campaign in Italy. After the Axis surrender in North Africa, a success he helped orchestrate, Alexander was given command of the 15th Army Group for the invasion of Sicily and then mainland Italy. Here, he fought not just the Germans, but the terrain itself, while commanding a true coalition, army of British, American, Commonwealth, Polish, and Free French forces. It was a logistical and political quagmire, fought in mountainous country that gave every advantage to the defender, and that made unity, not speed, his most important weapon. This was not a theatre where brilliance won wars. This was a theatre where mistakes destroyed alliances. Alexander's core strength was his uncanny ability to hold this multinational force together, balancing clashing national priorities and the massive egos of his subordinates. But restraint in war comes at a price. His steady campaign in Italy was slow and incredibly costly, and critics point to this as a weakness, arguing the front became a slogging match that drained Allied resources. No decision better captures that tension than what came next. One of the most controversial decisions made under his command was the bombing of the ancient monastery at Monte Cassino in February 1944. A move that remains fiercely debated. Historians still debate whether it was necessary, but Alexander absorbed the criticism, kept the alliance intact, and never let controversy fracture the coalition. That was the victory that mattered. Yet Italy was never meant to be won quickly. It was meant to be endured. The Italian campaign's primary strategic objective was to tie down German divisions that could have been sent to face the Normandy invasion or fight on the Eastern Front. Rome was finally liberated on June 4, 1944, just 2 days before D-Day. Though his subordinate, American General Mark Clark, controversially drove for the glory of capturing Rome, instead of trying to encircle the German 10th Army, Alexander kept his fury private to maintain Allied unity. And this is where Alexander's competence becomes visible. In a campaign where cohesion mattered more than glory, that restraint was decisive. For his masterful handling of a difficult campaign and a complex coalition, Harold Alexander secures his place on this list. Next up, our number 4 commanded more American soldiers than any general in history. Yet he's the one commander historians can't decide whether to praise or forget. At number 4 is the quintessential GI's general, Omar Bradley. In a war full of larger-than-life figures, Bradley was unassuming, analytical, and profoundly respected by the common soldiers he led. He was a planner, a logistician, and the commander of the largest single American field command in history, the 12th Army Group. Bradley's European service began in North Africa and Sicily, but his defining role came in 1944, when he was chosen to lead the American ground forces for the invasion of France. He oversaw the brutal landings at Utah and Omaha beaches on D-Day. As the Allied armies broke out from the beachhead, Bradley was elevated to command the 12th Army Group, a force that eventually swelled to over 1.3 million soldiers. Bradley would soon learn that commanding men is one thing, but commanding an army group is something else entirely. Bradley's style was methodical and cautious. He favored deliberate advances that minimized casualties and ensured his supply lines were secure, a stark contrast to the aggressive advances of his famous subordinate George S. Patton. That caution would become his greatest criticism, This cautiousness led some critics to argue he lacked the killer instinct needed to deliver a single, knockout blow to the German army in 1944. However, Bradley's competence is beyond dispute. The sheer scale of his management of the American war machine in Europe was an organizational marvel. He was a master of coordinating infantry, artillery, and logistics on a colossal scale. During the Battle of the Bulge, his leadership was crucial in staunching the German offensive and ultimately throwing it back. Bradley's genius was not in dramatic victories, but in the steady, relentless pressure his armies applied, grinding down the Wehrmacht until it collapsed. Few commanders in World War II are as polarizing as our number 3, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Monty, as he was known, was arrogant, famously difficult, and often abrasive with his American counterparts. But polarizing does not mean ineffective. But for all his notorious pride, he was also one of the most effective and inspirational battlefield commanders of the war. When Montgomery took command of the British 8th Army in North Africa in August 1942, he found a force demoralized by repeated defeats at the hands of Rommel's Afrika Korps. What followed was not improvisation, but preparation. With meticulous preparation and unshakable self-confidence, he completely revitalized it. He was a master of the set-piece battle, amassing overwhelming material superiority before launching an attack. And that method delivered something the Allies desperately needed: the decisive victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein, the first major land victory for the Western Allies against Germany and a true turning point in the war. El Alamein made Montgomery famous, but it was not his most consequential contribution. A strong case can be made that his greatest triumph was his role as the initial ground commander for the Normandy invasion. He was instrumental in the planning and correctly insisted on expanding the landing force to ensure its success. His strategy during the Battle of Normandy was to draw the bulk of German armoured divisions towards the British and Canadian forces around Caen, absorbing their counterattacks and enabling the American armies under Bradley to break out on the western flank. Yet, Monty's caution could also be a crippling weakness, at times slowing the Allied advance. That tension culminated in his greatest gamble. His career is forever marked by the ambitious but ultimately failed Operation Market Garden, a daring airborne assault intended to seize a bridgehead over the Rhine. Despite this, his ability to organize, train, and inspire troops was second to none. His men revered him, and in the dark days of 1942, he delivered a victory the Allies desperately needed. At number 2 is the man who oversaw the systematic destruction of the German army on the Eastern Front, Marshal of the Soviet Union, Georgy Zhukov. Georgy Zhukov destroyed more German divisions than all other Allied commanders combined, though the price he paid in Soviet lives makes us question whether he should be called a hero at all. Born to a peasant family, Zhukov was ruthless, iron-willed, and a master of the operational art of war on a scale almost unimaginable to his Western counterparts. If there was a major battle on the Eastern Front, Zhukov was likely involved. He played a pivotal role in organizing the desperate defense of Moscow in the winter of 1941, delivering the Wehrmacht its first great strategic defeat of the war. He was a key architect of the counter-offensive at Stalingrad, Operation Uranus, which was launched in November 1942 and culminated in the encirclement and annihilation of the entire German 6th Army by February 1943. His masterpiece, however, was arguably Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. Launched just after D-Day, this colossal offensive utterly shattered the German Army Group Center. Many historians now consider it an even greater disaster for the Germans than Stalingrad. Zhukov's doctrine was one of deep battle, using massed formations of tanks, artillery, and infantry to smash through enemy lines and exploit deep into their rear. Zhukov's methods were brutal, and the cost in Soviet lives was staggering, a major point of controversy in his legacy. He was a product of a totalitarian system and wielded his power absolutely. But his strategic brilliance was undeniable. Dwight Eisenhower himself recognized Zhukov's pivotal role in the Allied victory. It was Zhukov's forces that ground the German army to dust, tied down the bulk of its divisions in the east, and ultimately marched on Berlin to capture the capital of the Reich. And now, for our number one most competent Allied officer in Europe. He wasn't a battlefield tactician, but the supreme architect of the entire Allied war effort in the West, General of the Army, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower made the single most important decision of World War II. Yet German generals openly mocked his ability to command in battle. Some might argue that Ike lacked the frontline combat experience of others on this list. But to judge Eisenhower on battlefield tactics is to fundamentally misunderstand his genius. His job wasn't to win a firefight. It was to command the commanders. He was a politician, diplomat, and strategist rolled into one, and his primary weapon was his unmatched skill in coalition management. As Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower had to balance the competing demands of Roosevelt and Churchill, the clashing egos of Patton and Montgomery, and the national interests of the United States and Great Britain. It was a job that would have broken a lesser man. His leadership style, honed during the North Africa campaign, was built on consensus, cooperation, and an infectious confidence. That skill would be tested in a single decision with the fate of the war hanging on it. His greatest and most consequential decision came on the eve of June 6, 1944. With a storm churning the English Channel and the largest amphibious invasion force in history awaiting his command, Eisenhower weighed the conflicting reports, took a monumental gamble, and gave the order to launch the Normandy invasion. Critics sometimes point to his broad front strategy as being too slow, arguing a single concentrated thrust might have ended the war in 1944. But Eisenhower's approach prioritized logistics and ensured the entire Allied line advanced together, preventing the kind of disastrous overextension that could lose the war. He was the steady hand on the tiller, the political and diplomatic glue holding the fragile Allied coalition together. Without his unique brand of leadership, the unified command that made D-Day a success might well have fractured. For being the indispensable linchpin of the Western Alliance, Dwight D. Eisenhower stands as the most competent Allied officer in the European theater. From the mountains of Italy to the vast plains of Eastern Europe and the beaches of France, these 5 men, each with their own unique strengths and flaws, were architects of victory.